Hello everyone and welcome to another very nice game from yesterday's candidates tournament. It's round 9 and it's Kirill Alekseenko versus Grischuk. Quite an exhausting game, so better just dive straight into it. Kirill still without a win in this tournament, and Grischuk still looking for his chances to catch up to the leaders. So let's see what happened here. Alekseenko with the white pieces opens with e4. Sorry about that. And if you haven't seen the yesterday's video, do check it out, as it was also a very it's a game you don't want to miss. So e4, we have e6. Grischuk goes for the French defense with d4, d5, and now knight to c3. Whoa, d5 and knight to c3. We have knight to f6 and e5. Now going for the Steinitz variation, we advance the pawn, kick away the knight. So knight f to d7, and now as black is expected to attack the center with c5, we further defend our center with f4, and while doing so grab more space. So c5 attacking the center here, and knight to f3. We have knight to c6 and bishop to e3, going for the Boleslavsky variation. This is all very standard stuff, thousands of games in this exact same variation. And here black has a lot of very popular options, queen to b6 being one of them, bishop to e7, a6, so all very much playable stuff. But here for this game, Grischuk goes for c captures on d4, trading in the center right away. We have knight captures, and now queen to b6, developing the queen to b6. Now putting pressure on the center. Also the knight now cannot move because queen captures on e3 would come with check, and also the b2 pawn is under attack. And here Alekseenko says no problem, just queen to d2. And here Grischuk has the option of capturing the b2 pawn or not capturing the b2 pawn. But if you already play this line, you go after this pawn. That's how this line is played, and it's very interesting to see. Maxim couldn't hold on to his b2 pawn. Can Grischuk hold on to his b2 pawn? So here he grabs it with queen captures on b2, rook to b1, and now queen to a3, getting the queen out of the way, and now bishop to b5. So white getting a lot of development in for that pawn. But it is expected that white will win it back very quickly. So here knight captures on d4, bishop captures, and just a6, forcing the bishop to move. Here we have bishop captures on d7, bishop captures, and now rook to b3, kicking the queen back. You could also play rook to b3 before trading on d7. This has also been played, but for the sorry about that. Sorry about that, it was the mailman. It's like they know when I start recording. So rook to b3, like I said, it can be played before the trade on d7, but here Alekseenko does it afterwards. We have queen back to e7, and now rook captures on b7. And this is nothing new, this has all been played before. Looks very scary, but black is perfectly happy playing this. Queen to h4 with check. Now you can either block with the g3, but then you kind of weaken your position a bit too much. So here queen to f2, and Grischuk trades. We have captures on f2, king captures, and now bishop to e7. For the moment you don't really have the option of castling because, well, your light square bishop is hanging, but you are playing some, preparing some bishop to d8, bishop to c6, and then the bishop pair will get rid of that white rook. And here rook h to b1 is one known move that has been played in one game, but here we have knight to d1, and it is now as of move 18 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Grischuk deals with it. So basically you want to play knight to e3, and this will grant you support for pushing c4, and you will attack black's very strong center. So this is the idea Alekseenko has here, and he's basically playing on on some better development and some better pieces positioning, because if the position opens up, it is definitely Grischuk who still has the bishop pair. So here we have bishop to d8, preparing that bishop to c6 to get the rook away from such an active position. We have knight to e3, continuing with his plan of executing c4, and bishop to c6 now. So the rook now must leave. We have rook to b2, and now finally Grischuk is able to castle. So kingside castles. We have bishop to c5, now attacking the rook, but basically just remaneuvering the bishop. We have rook to e8, and only now do we strike in the center with c4. So what do you do here? Well, f6, you undermine white's center. We have c captures on d5, e captures on d5. This has created a passed pawn for Grischuk also, and the bishop to d6 now. So here, black will have some problems of getting those rooks into the game, as the a file cannot be used for rooks. The b file is now absolutely under white's control. So it will take some time for black to get those rooks into the game. So here we have captures, and d4 now. The d5 pawn is kind of weak now. You can very easily attack it here. So Grischuk needs to advance it. We have d4 attacking the knight, knight to f5, and now even d3. The pawn will be nicely defended when the bishop comes to b5. King to e3, attacking that pawn, and bishop to b5 now. So how can Alekseenko push for something here? We have king to e4, a very nice attacking move with the king. We have rook to c8. Grischuk finally gets his rook to a nice open c file, and knight to d4 now. White would very much enjoy eliminating one of black's bishops, so Grischuk needs to do something about this. Bishop to c4 is played, and now rook to d1. At some point, white might even have plans of giving up the exchange here with rook captures on d3, but it is much too early for such things. First a5 by Grischuk, we have a3, and now g6. Just improving the position a little bit, but also weakening the 7th rank. So Alekseenko immediately brings the rook over to b7, and now bishop to f6, shifting the bishop over to g7. Of course, the pawn is pinned. You cannot do anything about this. We have knight to f3. And now bishop to g7. We have rook to a7 going after the pawn here, and just rook c to d8. Now, sort of a little trick. If, of course, you capture the pawn, then the bishop is for free. The pawn is pinned. You will not be able to capture it. So here, king to d4 by Alekseenko, and now Grischuk needs to find a move here. He basically only needs to find a way how to activate his rooks, because his bishop pair is doing all right, but the rooks not so much. And here, a move like rook captures on d6 might be an interesting one. Basically, you just eliminated this piece. Of course, the rook cannot be captured, but white will capture this. And now we could go into a very, very tricky line of rook to c8 check, king to b3, rook to b6 check, king to a4, and now rook to c4 with check. We give up a pawn here, and now rook to b3, and it could be very dangerous for the white king here. If knight to d2 going after the rooks, we do not want to capture this pawn. We just want to keep the king stuck here on the a file. So rook c5 check, for example, king to a4, now rook b8, keeps the king here on the a file. And now if we could activate our dark square bishop somehow, could be some very, very interesting mating ideas here. But okay, Grischuk goes for something different. After king d4, he just moves the bishop to b3, and it makes sense. Now there is no target on c4. You move the bishop with tempo, and now rook captures bishop is definitely still a threat, because this is impossible. And it doesn't seem like you have all that much you can do here. For example, if you just move the bishop, rook to b1, doesn't really matter. Just rook captures on d6 with check, and now whatever you do doesn't really work. If king to c3, we can just bring the bishop back, so that obviously doesn't work. And if you try something like king to c5, not much better. We're just going to play rook d5 check, king c6, and then just, for example, d2, if you capture the bishop, d1 queen. And so on. So not an easy decision for Alekseenko here, but he had all of this planned out. So here he just goes for it. Rook captures on g7 with check. Grischuk, of course, has to capture, and now comes a rook captures on d3. This was his idea. Now, well, now Grischuk has is up the exchange, but his rook's still not very active, so he needs to try and activate himself somehow. First a4. That the bishop and pawn are now nicely defending each other, and Alekseenko will need to figure out how to do something about this. So here knight to d2, ready to capture, and now bishop back to e6. Interesting, well, rather interesting was bishop to c2, and if rook to c3, then rook to c8. We definitely want to trade off a pair of rooks here, but then, for example, knight to c4, we go bishop d1, and the game continues. It's all very, very interesting, and this bishop pawn barrier here is just very hard to deal with, even though you have two rooks. So after knight d2, we have bishop back to e6, and now comes knight to e4. Now this knight is coming to c5, and it's going to be, well, it's just going to be a very strong piece here. So here, bishop to f5, Grischuk says, all right, that knight isn't going anywhere, we're going to eliminate it as soon as possible. So rook to e3, and now bishop captures on e4. We have rook captures and rook to f8. And here Grischuk says, all right, we've traded everything off now. You still have the knight, bishop, and pawn here in the center, but I'm going to use these open files to get my rooks into the game. If I can play rook f2, it's basically game over. So of course Alekseenko stops this. He plays king to e3. And rook f back to e8, asking, okay, what are you gonna do now? We have rook to we have king to f4, and now rook to a8, just defending that a4 pawn. We have rook to b4. And now comes rook to a7, not allowing any checks along the 7th rank. We have king to e4, and now king to f7 by Grischuk. We have rook to b6, grabbing more space, and now rook to c8. So now you will try to go after the pawns this way. So here, just bishop to b4. Very interesting here is e6, although it doesn't do all that much. You can't capture the pawn because this just wins material, but you don't have to capture the pawn. You can just move your king, and that's it. For example, king to g8, and it doesn't seem to be like there's well, all that much you can do here. You're never getting this pawn to this light square because well, black has two rooks, and you can easily defend the light square. White only has a dark square bishop, so you're not going to help out with the queening of the pawn. But okay, after rook to c8, we have bishop to b4, and now comes rook 8 to c7. Interestingly, if you go for some rook to c2 action here, then the rook left the back rank, and the d8 square is no longer defended, so e6 could be a little bit dangerous here. So Grischuk still not ready to commit to this. We have rook 8 to c7, now doubling up on the c file, and now this rook can come to c2, while this rook can remain here guarding the back rank. And now king to d5. Alekseenko says, I no longer care about the back rank, I now go in, well, basically going all in. So rook to c2, going after the king side pawns. Now e6 with check, king f6, and now rook to b7, with some ideas of rook to f7 check, which could be deadly. For example, if you play something like h5, we just play rook f7 check, and after something like this, just e7, and it's very hard to deal with this. White will definitely win this. Rook to f8 is coming. You cannot deliver any checks. The bishop very nicely controls this, so it's well, it's bad news. So here, Grischuk goes for g5 instead. Now this is a little bit different. And now comes, well, now you can also capture the h7 pawn. Rook to f7 check here, not so great, because now the king can come to g6, and it's well, now it's different. Now you can never push the pawn. The rook will be under attack, so very important square for the black king. So instead, after g5, we have rook captures on h7, and now comes rook captures on g2. You could also try some rook to d8 check ideas, maybe to get the white king away, but then you can just block rook to d7, and it doesn't do all that much. For example, rook to e8, we're going to play rook to f7 check, king to g6, now we're going to go back, rook to a7, go after the a4 pawn, and if now rook captures on g2, we're going to play king to d6. So it's a very hard to play this. Rook to e2, you have to cover that pawn, otherwise king to d7 is just winning. And now we're going to play e7, and it's basically a draw, but you know, it's always a draw. This is the candidates tournament. Every position is a draw until it's not. So one of the possibilities definitely. But here instead we have rook captures on g2. Grischuk grabs the pawn right away. Now king to d6. Again, ready to push that pawn. We have king to g6, pushing the rook back, and now rook to h3, still keeping an eye on the h2 pawn. We have g4 now, rook to e3, and now comes rook captures on h2, finally. We have king to d7, now attacking the rook, ready to push the pawn, and rook h to h8 now. Like we said, we have to keep an eye on the e8, that is a light square. We have e7, and now comes rook c to e8. King f5 also a possibility here. You might still be in time to maybe get your king deeper into the position, start pushing that pawn. But Grischuk goes rook c to e8 instead. And here Grischuk adopted this rook maneuvering technique, and while Magnus was commenting on this on the live stream, he said that maybe Grischuk adopted this technique of maybe just moving the rooks along the back rank in order to get Alekseenko to play for a win and then look for his chances. But it's a very dangerous strategy. So here bishop to d6 by Alekseenko. And now comes rook back to a8, now just defending the a4 pawn once again, and here we have bishop to c7. Interestingly, if you go for pawn promotion here, not really all that great, because after rook captures, we're gonna play rook captures, and if rook captures and king captures, now we're gonna get king to f5. But if king to d7, for example, we're gonna get king to e4, now king to c6, and now king back to f5. You never want to play this and try to push this pawn, because white king is just too fast. He's gonna pick up this pawn and then queen this pawn. So you'd have to go king f5, and then if king b5, we go king to e6, and this is how we save the game, because after the bishop moves, it doesn't really matter where you're going to play king d7, and it only matters for the black king to reach the a8. This is a light square, and it doesn't matter if you lose both of these pawns. There's only a dark square bishop and a pawn on the a file, and it's of course a light square against a dark square bishop. The black king will be able to draw this if he reaches the corner. So a bit too soon for this. Alekseenko still wants to keep chances alive, so he goes bishop to c7. Now rook 8 to g8 by Grischuk. Again, just remaneuvering his rooks. We have rook to e4 with an attack on the pawns, and now king to f5, defending this pawn, and now comes rook to f4 with check. You might be thinking, why not rook captures on a4? Well, then we go into this g3 line, and it's not much. For example, bishop to f4 check, king g6, rook to e4, and now we're gonna go g2. And now after bishop to b6, guarding the queening square, we go into some very, very cool lines. King to f5 attacks the rook, rook to e2, and now finally g1 queen. We're gonna play bishop captures on g1, rook captures on g1, and now e8 queen. We're gonna go captures, captures, and now rook to a1, and of course this is a well-known drawn position. Even though white is up a pawn, doesn't really matter. So after king to f5, Alekseenko says, nope, it's still much too early to grab this pawn. Rook to f4 with check. We have king to g5, and only now rook captures on a4. And now the king is kind of blocking the g pawn, so you don't really have the option of pushing it. So here, king to h4 by Grischuk, and now comes, rook to e4. Very interesting idea is bishop to d6, with the idea of maybe rook to f4 to f8, but then rook to h7, and it's very hard to decipher what is going on here. But it is definitely a possibility, this bishop to d6 move. Alekseenko goes for a different line. He goes rook to e4, and now Grischuk retreats with rook to a8. But now it's different. Now that the rook moved to a4, both a4 and a5 are covered, and now Alekseenko can just push his passed pawn. So a5, now the a pawn also becomes a problem. And now Grischuk has to go back, king to g5. Problem is, if you go king to h3, then you get this a5 move, g3, and now e8 queen, and we get basically a very similar idea of what we've already shown. Captures, captures, and then after everything gets traded off here on the e file, we're going to play g2, but now bishop to b6 saves the day. So white just wins here. So instead, after a4, we have king to g5. Grischuk needs to go back, and now a5. Like we said, this is protected, and now you have problem. Because now king comes here, the rook is under attack, you're going to have to move the rook away, and then, for example, king from b7 covers all of these three squares, could be a problem. So rook to h7, and now king to c6, unpinning. Now you will be able to play something like bishop to d8 to block the queening square. So rook h back to h8, and now king back to d7. Here we have a repetition of moves, but of course Alekseenko still not ready to call it a draw. He still needs to be pushing, so rook h to h8, and now rook to e3. For king to b7, even though it looks very appealing, it is a bit too soon, because here we're going to go g3, a6, g2, and now, for example, rook to e1, guarding that g1 square. Now we're going to play rook 8 to a8, and now comes a7. So here we're going to play rook to h1, and now comes a really cool series of moves. a8 queen, rook captures on a8, and now bishop to d8, blocking the queening square from the rook and also preparing queening with a discovery here. So here we're going to play rook captures on e1, now covering the queening square, but it doesn't matter. E8 with check from the bishop, rook captures, queen captures, and now king to g4, and this is a draw because, well, you still have a rook and a pawn that's ready to queen, and the black will simply not be able to get out of checks, but a really cool line. So after this, we have rook to e3. Alekseenko still not rushing it with moves like king to b7, and now rook h to e8. Grischuk again shifts the rooks along the 8th rank. King to d7, but now it's much different. Because if you go rook to h8 now, then just e8 queen, and that's it. For example, captures, and then it doesn't matter. You either trade here, and then of course we can still stop the g-pawn with the bishop, or if you go rook to a6, it doesn't really matter. You're just going to play rook g8 check, and you are never crossing that g3 square with the pawn. It's just winning for white. So after king d7, we have king to f6 by Grischuk, and now rook to e6 with check. We have king to f7, and now rook back to e4. We have king f6, Grischuk, of course, hoping for a repetition here, but now bishop to d8, and there isn't much you can do here. The rook is under attack. So here, if you move it to just e8 queen, wins the game. Obviously, you have to... it's a discovery from the bishop, so you don't really have an option of capturing the queen. So you have to go for captures, king captures, now rook captures, and of course this is now winning for white. You will easily sacrifice this rook for the pawn, and you will queen your own pawn. So after bishop to d8, Grischuk has one last attempt, king f5, but now just king captures on e8, king captures on e4, and king to f8. And it was in this position on move 74 that Alexander Grischuk resigned the game, as there was nothing more to be done here. Whatever you play, let's say g3, just e8 queen comes with check, and that's just it. So really an amazing game, and it's beyond impressive how Alekseenko held his own against a monster player like Sasha here, and he really was not interested in a draw. He just kept pushing, kept looking for chances, and maybe it does all come down to this, that Magnus said that maybe Grischuk was just moving his rooks along the back rank to kind of get Alekseenko to play for a win, but you know what they say, be careful what you wish for. Here maybe Alexander wished for that, and Alekseenko definitely went for the win, and he did win it. So really impressive stuff. First the win for Alekseenko in the FIDE 2021, or rather 2020-2021 candidates tournament, so very nice for that. Congratulations. And also let us not miss out on the standings. So here are the standings. It's a bit large. Let me just downsize this. It's from chess24, so there you go. All right, there we go. So after round 8, we had two decisive games. The one that we've shown, Fabiano Caruana versus Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, and this one, Kirill Alekseenko versus Alexander Grischuk, and these are the standings after round 8. So Jan Nepomniachtchi is still leading because he was the leader going into round 8, and he was able to draw his game, followed by Fabiano Caruana, who won his game against Maxim Vachier-Lagrave. Then we have Anish Giri and Van Gogh with 4. A nice 50%. Alekseenko and Grischuk with 3.5, and the Ding Liren still with 3 points. So in last place, but he did give, well, sort of a crippling blow to Fabiano Caruana, as he did defeat him in the first half of the candidates tournament. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We're gonna continue covering the candidates tournament, and maybe I see you guys are suggesting a lot of games, so I will see if I will have time to cover those. But mostly we'll be sticking to the candidates tournament, until the end, because these are kind of important games for the chess world. I would like to thank Philip Gleason, Mr. Hoodie Guy, Robert Smith, Pablo Mohan, and Patrick Solars for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the candidates tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.